What's up, y'all? This is Hammer here again, back with another video. And today I'm going to be talking about something quite unique. I'm going to be answering the question, are North Africans black and should they even be considered black? Now, the reason why I'm having this conversation is because, I was in a recent debate in which we were going back and forth, right? And essentially the cause of the debate was that, me and many other of my Pan-African friends were saying, look, North Africans are not really Africans, and Pan-Africanism really should not include North Africa. It really is centered around blackness. And of course, this, North African, this dude from North Africa was having a debate with me. And the thing is this, right? Here's what North Africans need to understand. Okay. You guys may occupy the North African tip, but you are not indigenous to the African continent. Okay. It's the same way how it's the same thing with America here, right? The majority of people who occupy the United States and sort of North America are white, but they're not indigenous to North America. Most of the people who live in Northern Africa essentially come from Middle East, if not the Arabian Peninsula. And so when we talk about Africa, we talk about, Pan-Africanism, right? We typically, especially when it comes to the newer movements, try to focus on black people because black people are the indigenous population. So yes, when we say African, when we say, Pan-Africanism, we typically don't include the North Africans because you guys are not indigenous to the African continent. But before we get into this video, let's get into our intro. The question then comes back to this. Why is it that North Africans, or as I like to call them, Arabs, why is it that North Africans get so triggered and get so upset when they're told they're not African? Even though they themselves don't really identify themselves as African, right? Northern Africans view themselves as Arabs. And a great example of this is what happened recently at the World Cup, where you had, Morocco, right? One of the only teams from the African continent that was actually able to make it close to the semifinals. And as they were beating, other teams and making it up there, the news articles were saying, oh, Morocco's win is a win for both the Arabs and Africans, right? But you had essentially team players, right? Players from the Moroccan team that were saying, no, every win we have is for the Arab world. Now, of course, a lot of black Africans were triggered, from West Africa to East Africa. I say, why are you guys triggered? What these Moroccan players are saying is true. They're not African. They're Arabs, right? They're Arabs that migrated over and essentially, occupied the North African strip, right? It's kind of like think of North America, for example, right? Most of the people who live in North America are white because white Europeans migrated and essentially occupy North America. But we know that white people are not the indigenous population of North America. The same thing applies with Africa. Most of these North Africans are Arabs that migrate to that region, and they're not the indigenous population. So yeah, when they're telling you they're not African, like they're not lying to you. They're really not. They're Arabs who occupy the North African strip. But the crazy part is that when we then turn around and tell these North Africans that, hey, you're not African and you're not part of the Pan-Africanist, world, then they want to get triggered. Look, I've said it before, okay? A black person from Jamaica, a black person from Haiti, even a black American is way more African than a North African will ever be. And the reason is very simple. Those people are descendants of the black indigenous populations here on the African continent. But the North Africans are essentially descendant from the Arabs who are not indigenous to the African continent. But with that being said, let me go ahead and play this video and let's get some more thoughts into this.
And not all Africans are black.
No. The rest of the video was great, except for this part. If you are not phenotypically black, you are not African.
Now, this is what I'm talking about, okay? And her reaction represents how a lot of North Africans react when we tell them this, right? She looks like what most North Africans look like. If you look at her, would any of you guys think she's black or she's African? The reality of the situation is this, okay? she resembles she looks like mostly North Africans, right? But she resembles those who live in the Middle East. And the reason is very simple, okay? Your ancestors are not indigenous to the African continent. Your ancestors came from the Middle East. That's the reality. That's why you look like them. But see, here's the problem. When we tell them you're not African, you're Arabs, they want to get triggered. But see, when they're amongst themselves, they will call themselves Arabs. It's funny to me, and it is pathetic. My thing is this: don't do it both ways, because you look. You know, the reason why this gets me triggered, right, is that they really do try to play both sides, right? I'm gonna give you an example. A lot of people may not know this, but Morocco tried at one point to actually join the European Union. They actually tried, but the EU said, "Hell to the no! You guys are not white, and you need to get the fuck up out of here," right? And then, of course, later on, they joined the African Union. Why do I have a problem with this, right? I have a problem with this because Morocco represents a large percentage, not the majority of North Africans, where they don't really want anything to do with most Black Africans. They don't. Most of them are identified with Arabs. Most of them are trying to be either white or be accepted in the Arab world because they look those people. But see, since those other groups, quote unquote, denied them, now they want to call them Africa. It's like, no, you're not African, bro. Once again, you guys are not indigenous to the African continent, right? You guys are essentially the African version of white Americans. White Americans came to North America, wiped out the indigenous group, and essentially occupied the region, but they're not the indigenous population. You guys came from the Middle East, wiped out the sort of indigenous Black groups there, and you occupied the northern tip, but you're not indigenous. So yes, when we say African, when we say Pan-Africanism, we're referring to Black people or these sort of Black sub-Saharan Africans because they are the indigenous population, which is the reason why we tell you that, hey, a Black person in Haiti is more African than North Africans because they descend from the indigenous people in sub-Saharan Africa. You guys descend from the Middle East. But you know what? Let's go. Let me show you guys another video here. Let's see this way.
North Africans are not indigenous to North Africa. White North Africans stem from the Barbary slave trade and stem from being in slavery to different Ottomans. They say it is estimated that over 3 million Europeans were sent to North Africa as slaves and servants in Muslim territories and countries. From around the 1400s until the late 1800s, you had white slaves being taken captive to North Africa. So of course these people are not connected to the ancient history. You can see this European slave to this so-called Arab man. So once again, these people are not connected to the Israelites, they're not connected to the Moors, and they're not connected to the Egyptians. These people come from Europe. Just because they live in North Africa, now that don't mean they are indigenous. These people, their lineage comes from Europe. They are slaves.
Now, shout out to the brother here. Now, he's like 80%, right? Part of them, they come from Europe, but most of them come from the Middle East. But that's what I'm talking about. Is that, most of the people in North Africa are not indigenous. They're not. Most of them came from the Middle East. And I think that, as we're starting to have this conversation, especially within the Black diaspora, within the sort of, Pan-African sphere, and we're making it very clear that, look, the only reason why you guys are part of the African Union, the only reason why we're even interacting with y'all is for political reasons. But on the ground, and in reality, we know that you guys are not really African. You guys are Arabs. And I think that Black folks, especially the Black diaspora, need to start being honest about this. Stop trying to force North Africa. They're not. They're Arabs who are not indigenous, and they occupy the North African tip. But let me just show you guys another example of what I'm talking about, right? Right here is a quick picture of the North African tip. Kind of show you how complex this gets, right? We have, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, right? These areas are what I would call the majority Arab states, and maybe Western Sahara will drop in there, right? So these people, most of the people who essentially occupy these regions up here, these, I think, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, those countries, Arabs for the most part, right? Now, things get more complicated when we start to look at, for example, Mauritania, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa. And I'm going to break this down for y'all, okay? When we look at Mauritania, okay, Mauritania essentially is a country in which it's a mixed population. It originally had a majority of black population, but they were essentially colonized by Arabs. That's the best way for me to describe it. They were essentially Arabs, right? In which you have a significant black population, but the Arabs there essentially dominated the country and subjugated the black population there. So Mauritania essentially is an example of a country where, even though they have a large population, a large black population in the southern region, the northern region is mainly Arab, and the Arab essentially control that country. So Mauritania, in my opinion, is not really included in sort of the Pan-Africanism, in the African black, coalition. So I don't even consider Mauritanians as really being part of the Pan-African sphere. They're Arabs, right? They're essentially a country that was colonized by the Arabs, and they're essentially really in the Arab sphere, right? And it's also a part of the Arab League, right? So keep that in mind, okay? Sudan is a great example of it. Now keep in mind, guys, Sudan essentially split between North and Southern Sudan. And the reason is actually very much racial. So Sudan essentially was a country that was colonized by the British and of course the Egyptians, right? The Arabs essentially helped colonize that region, right? And you had three classifications. You had the Arabized, right? The sort of black Arabized people. You had the black Muslims, and you had the sort of black Christians and the sort of black traditionalists. Those are the three groups, right? The Arabized, black folks right there, right? They essentially believed that they were Arabs. Even though many of them have black phenotypes, they view themselves Arabs. Black Muslims are black people that, although they practice Islam, right, they view themselves as black African first. And then you have the quote-unquote black Christian, black traditionalists, where they believe in Christianity or the traditional values, but they view themselves as black first, right? I'm going to give you an example, right? Here in the United States, the Nation of Islam, right? These are black folks who practice Islam, but they view themselves as black people first. So in Sudan, the black Muslims and sort of the black Christians, traditionalists, view themselves black first. The black, the Arabized, right? Blacks. These are folks who, although they have some black phenotypes, they're very much mixed with Arabs, and they view themselves as Arab. Like, you will literally see a guy that will walk down the street who looks like Barack Obama. He will call himself an Arab. So these people, right, the Arabs, right, the quote unquote Arabized blacks, essentially were put into power, right? And they essentially tried to Arabize the entire country. And so South Sudan were mainly black Christians, black traditionalists who identify as black people first. Look, we're not Arabs. And that was really one of the biggest motive in that war. So they broke away. Then, of course, you had the black Muslims in the region of Darfur, and they were essentially damn near genocide and erased. And so really now Sudan is really just made up of North Sudan, where it's just a bunch of Arabized, really black Arabs, essentially, right? These are quote-unquote black folks who are heavily mixed with Arabs. Many of them have Arab features, and they view themselves as Arabs. They don't view themselves as black folks. It's not like Mali or Senegal, right? Mali is a majority, Muslim country, but Malayans view themselves as black. Same thing with Senegals, right? Same thing with folks in Sierra Leone. But Sudanese people, North Sudanese, many of them are mixed with Arabs. They identify as Arabs. They don't view themselves as black. So that's the reason why when it comes to Mauritania, when it comes to the Sudanese, even though they quote unquote, many of them do share some, quote unquote, Negro African features, they are essentially not really considered black Africans. They're essentially considered Arabs. So I will put them in the same category as the North Africans, right? Including Western Sahara. Now, when we go to the Horn of Africa, things get a little bit more complicated, right? Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia. Okay. Djibouti and Somalia are a little complicated because both of them are also part of the Arab League. But people need to understand, okay, Djibouti and Somalia, just like Sudan and Mauritania, right, are essentially black folks that essentially have mixed with Arabs. So if you go to those countries, you will see a lot of people with quote unquote strong Negro features, but you can tell they're mixed and they identify as Arabs. Now, Somalia's a little more mixed because, in Somalia, some will say they're Arabic, some will say they're African, but it's a little, so off and up. But for me, I will put North Africa, Mauritania, Sudan, Djibouti, and Somalia in these sort of, Arabic camp, right? These are Arabs, right? I'm not saying Muslim because there's a difference. There's a difference. Arab is actually like a racial, really, classification. So I'm talking about those who actually identify themselves as Arabs, right? So because like before, right? People in Mali, West Africa, they're Muslims, but they're black first, right? They're the black people. Couple of folks, Somalia, Djibouti, Sudan, Mauritania. Many of these folks may have a strong black presence, but many of them are mixed with the Middle East with Arabs. So these people identify as Arabs. So really, I don't consider them a part of these sort of Pan-African sort of African definition. For me, African mean those who are black indigenous population and those who identify as black indigenous people. So if you are somebody in Sudan, so the majority of folks in North Sudan and Mauritania and Somalia and Djibouti identify as Arab, even if you may look black, well, guess what? Now you're Arabic. So that's how it goes. I think for me, the only outlier here is going to be Ethiopia and Eritrea, because these countries also heavily mixed. You can actually tell by their phenotypes that they have a very heavily mixed quote unquote Arabic influence. But I think what separates them though from the rest is that it's more mixed, where many Ethiopians, many Eritreans will identify more on the black side, even though they are more mixed. So it's a weird dichotomy. So even though Ethiopians and Eritreans look very similar to North Sudanese, folks from Djibouti, from Somalia, they tend to identify more with quote unquote the black indigenous identity. So for me, what I will say is this, is that the people who I don't consider as being part of, the African definition, the Pan-African definition, are North Africans, including Mauritanians, Sudan, Djibouti, and Somalia, because those people have made it very clear they view themselves Arabs. And so Arabs are not indigenous to African continent. So if you're calling yourself an Arab, then you are no longer part of the indigenous black coalition. I think the only outliers here are Eritrea and Ethiopia. I think for me, I will put them in the middle, meaning that it depends on the person. To be honest, I will put Eritrea and Ethiopia more more in the black section, because most of them do identify more as quote unquote black indigenous groups. So I think I will put them into that category. But outside of that, the rest of the sub-Saharan region are essentially black indigenous Africans, right? So the rest of the sort of sub-Saharan African region are essentially black indigenous people. So really, the quote unquote Arab the quote unquote Arab invaders make up the small minority of the continent, right? Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Western Sahara, Mauritania, Sudan, Djibouti, and Somalia. Okay, those folks to me on the Arab category. You guys are not African. You guys are not part of the indigenous African group. Many of you guys are essentially mixed with Arab. You identify as Arab. That's great. So the African identity and the Pan-African identity will only be reserved for these sort of black indigenous sub-Saharan African. And I think when it comes to Eritrea and Ethiopia, I'll put them into that category too, as sort of the black indigenous sub-Saharan Africans. Or even though many of them are mixed, they tend to lean more in that direction. And so that's kind of how I will break it up. And I feel like the Pan-African, quote unquote African definition is really being uploaded. I feel like right now we're making it very clear. Look, we are claiming the continent back. Okay, black people are the indigenous to this continent. We're claiming it back. You guys, if you're an Arab, you're not African. You're not indigenous. You're not indigenous to the African continent. And so the African classification and the Pan-African classification will be only for those who are the black indigenous group, which make up the majority of sub-Saharan Africa, right? And I would also include Ethiopia and Eritrea in that classification, but everything outside of that is gone. So the people who are on my exclusion list are going to be Mauritania, West Sahara, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti. Those countries, in my opinion, should not be classified as African. They should be classified as Arabs on the North African continent. So with that being said, that's my view right there. You guys tell me what you guys think. I'm tired of North Africans and quote unquote those who identify as Arabs being triggered when we tell them that you guys are not African, when they themselves don't identify with the Black indigenous population. So I'm just making it very clear that all of you who are part of the Arab League, all of you who identified yourselves as Arabs, you have made it very clear that you identify more with the Arabs. You are no longer going to be part of the indigenous Black classification. So let me be clear. With that being said, make sure you guys like, subscribe, and of course, hammer out.